Obama had an ancestor who had been had a sentence of lifetime bond servitude imposed upon him. That fellow's name was John Punch. But the interesting thing that they were playing up, in the papers was this was on his mother's side, not his father's side. But here's the only document that exists about John Punch. And John Punch, what's interesting is he runs away with two other bond servants, right? One is Victor, a Dutchman, and the other a Scotchman named James Gregory. They're still not white, right? Next slide, Sean. The big battle is there were no white people there. Bacon's Rebellion, 1670. This is the big battle that Allen focuses on, and we're going to talk about in some depth. But here's the account of the fellow who took the lead in putting down the rebellion, named Thomas Grantham. He's a ship merchant. I there met 400 English and Negroes in arms, who were much dissatisfied, betrayed them. Some were for shooting me, others for cutting me in pieces. In the final stages, 80 Negroes and 20 English. Don't leave yet, Sean. One thing, just anecdotally, since I talked before about Harrison's struggle to do Negro with a capital N, right? That was because it was now, when Harrison comes here, it's all being spelled with a small n. But back in the 17th century, before the invention of the white race, this is the original document. Negro is with a capital N. Go on. All right, here's the main theses of Allen's work. If you don't leave here with anything else, try to just hear this, right? 3 prongs. The white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor's solidarity as manifested in the latter Civil War stages of Bacon's Rebellion, but not only in that struggle. There was a whole period of solidarity, and struggle going on, which I'll talk about. 2, a system of racial privileges was deliberately instituted by the late 17th, early 18th century Anglo-American bourgeoisie in order to define and establish the white race and establish a system of racial oppression. Deliberately instituted, very important, we'll talk about why. 3, the consequence was not only ruinous to the interest of the African Americans, all African Americans, not only those who were enslaved, but but it was also disastrous for European American workers. That last thing about not in the interest of the European American workers is where some people who have talked about this white privilege going all the way back, even the Weathermen and stuff like that, don't get Allen, right? Because Allen's arguing, of course they get him and they reject him, but that's not what Allen's saying. This is what Allen's saying. And by that he means their own position, the laboring class people, vis-a-vis the rich and powerful, was not improved but was weakened by the white skin privilege system. And we're going to try and document why. So what he's arguing is the white race was a political invention. It is no part of genetic evolution. Next slide. He says more about the white race. He says it must be understood not simply as a social construct, but as a ruling class social control formation. Why does he emphasize ruling class? Because if you just say it's a social construct and you're not clear on who's driving that ship, then you fall back on all the racist arguments, the cultural, it's innate, right? Why? How else do you explain it? Why would we construct such a thing unless it was innate? Unless you can focus on the origin and who's driving it. He says more about the white race. And this is what first attracted me to Allen's work some many years ago, when he spoke at the precursor to the Brecht Forum right here on 14th Street, a place called Alternate U, way back, which is the grandmother of this place. And I was in the crowd like you folks, and I heard him for the first time. But he argues that the white race has served as the principal historic guarantor of ruling class domination of national life in the United States. We in this room particularly, if that's true, we got to deal with that, right? Next slide. He says more. He explains that the white race is an all-class formation, right? You got the ruling elite, you got the middle elements, and you got the white race, right? He says what is key holding it together is the racial privileges conferred on laboring class European Americans. That's the key, right? Because, well, we'll get into it, it's not in their interest, but that's what holds that thing together. And here, and I did 33 years in the labor movement, so this next phrase was very important to me, this next understanding. If it's an all-class formation that serves the ruling class, Allen argues it is the basic, most prevalent and historic form of class collaborationism in the U.S., right? That's it, in a nutshell, that's the key. All right. He also argues it's the quintessential peculiar institution. For those familiar with a lot of U.S. history, you know in the period of slavery, particularly the slaveholding elite would, with their code words, talk about our peculiar institution with all the arrogance, that comes from that. And just like they didn't want to name it in the Constitution, right? Our peculiar institution, and then they give a wink, right? Well, Allen stands all that on his head, and he says in the United States, the truly peculiar institution is this white race, right? And only by understanding what is peculiar about the peculiar institution can one know what is exceptional about American exceptionalism. Now, this phrase, American exceptionalism, people familiar with left history, there's a whole history of discussion in communist, socialist literature about, quote, American exceptionalism. And why is it that the U.S. seems to be exempt from the normal course of class struggle that develops in other advanced capitalist countries? Why are we so backwards, right? There's a big discussion on it, which I'll show in a second. And let's go, Sean, we'll flip. So that's some of the background on just overview of Allen and the white race. Now, here's when he starts out to write the book. He starts out to write the book in the 1960s. He's already been active for 40 years, right? Not 40 years. He's in his 40s, but been active for many years in his adult life. History of my book. He starts out, he has a fascination with history. He's got an identification with the ordinary people. He lived his last 50 years, Brooklyn Avenue and Dean Street in Brooklyn. He's a regular person, just like Harrison, 231 West 134th Street, the most densely populated block in Harlem. These are working class intellectuals of the people, right? My moral conviction that racial discrimination is a bad thing. So he starts with just some basic good foundations, right? Good human foundations. He's influenced by the changed ambiance of the American civil rights struggle, which I said how it influenced, I commented earlier from Harrison, how it influenced so much and so many people in so many ways. And Allen was certainly one. And it led him to ponder, could it be possible that the key to defeat suffered by democratic, progressive, populist, and socialist movements in this country was related to this in some way, and maybe the answer to this question of American exceptionalism. He was influenced by Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which I cited earlier. He didn't know about Harrison in this early period because Harrison was outside much of this discourse. And around 1965, he sets out to write a history, and he's going to look at the three major crises in U.S. history, which is very important for us today because we're moving deeply into this next crisis, and we've got to learn the lessons of what happened in the last three major crises. And those three crises are of the 1870s, 1890s, and the populist period, 1930s Depression. He also sought to address, on the theoretical level, because he's a lefty, like many people here, why no socialism in the U.S., and why was there that generally low level of class consciousness in this country compared to so many other places. He reviewed the literature that was out there by the leading left, labor, and regular, general historians, right? Engels, Marx's co-worker, Sorg, who translates capital into English, right? Hillquit, leader in the Socialist Party, Foster, leader in the Communist Party, the Beards, Frederick Jackson Turner, and so on and so on. And he sums up their work, and this is all documented, chapter and verse, with that they put forth a basic six-pronged rationale explaining the low level of class consciousness in the United States. And in a nutshell, here's what the six prongs are. Early right to vote and other constitutional liberties, heterogeneity of the working class, free land, safety valve, higher wages, social mobility, the early development of an aristocracy of labor. Allen's critique. Each of the six prongs is more myth than reality, and again, go into, the writings are available, so you can read all his documentation again from primary sources. But each of the six prongs is more myth than reality. Free land, what free land? It was going to the railroads, it was going, normal people aren't getting this, working people aren't getting this. And they all have to be re-examined in light of white supremacy. And he points out that each of these 6 factors are white skin privileges, and whatever their effect upon the thinking of white workers may be said to be, the same could not be claimed in the case of black workers. Next. So, Allen countered with his own theory, and this is still back in the 60s. White supremacy, reinforced amongst Europeans by white skin privilege, was the main retardant of working class consciousness in the U.S. Efforts at radical social change should direct principal efforts at challenging the system of white supremacy and white skin privileges. This is the main retardant. This is what we got to deal with. Next. Here, this is very important, I think. This is the one that attracted me to him when I first heard him. I said, wow, this is deep, right? He reviewed the 3 periods of national crisis that I mentioned, and he argues and documents how he thinks and how I think he shows the key to defeat of the forces of democracy, labor, and socialism was in each period achieved by ruling class appeals to white supremacism, basically by fostering white skin privileges of laboring class European Americans. Next. Here's the Great Depression, the most recent one. Here's an example. Great Depression, what happens? There's all that struggle we know about, but Ira Katznelson teaches history up at Columbia University. He's written a book, When Affirmative Action Was White. Describes how each and every federal program from the 1930s into the 1960s was shaped in a white supremacist fashion. We look at the major labor legislation. Again, that's the background I'm coming out of. The Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Labor Relations Act, Social Security until 1951. They exclude agricultural and domestic workers. 60% of the black and Latino workforce, 70% in down south, right? The GI Bill. The GI Bill, you can get a home with 0 down payment and a low interest loan, right? Here's where we live, New York area. Statistics for those GI homeowner loans, out of 67,000 that are awarded, less than 100 go to families of color. That's how you get the white suburbs around New York and every other city in this country. Federal government policy, right? Ruling class policy. Here's the other big one, and this one I can't emphasize enough. I really can't emphasize this one enough. This whole jobs thing, right? And people say, oh, we need an FDR-type jobs program. Not quite. When the Depression starts in 1929, the black to white unemployment ratio was 1-to-1, which if you think about it makes sense because black people are brought here to labor, right? So it's not surprising that they're laboring, right? By 1947, after all those programs of the New Deal, the ratio and the war employment, right? The ratio is 2-to-1, which is all anyone in this room has ever known. 2-to-1 or some variant of 2-to-1, right? Government policy. Next. No, this one's very important. Allen summarizes, and I think this is instructive because we're going to come back to this. He says, so if we step back a little and we look at the history of struggle in this country and, you know, how this capitalism is working here, he says, in the normal course of capitalist events, there's a deterioration in the condition of working people. We all kind of know that. He says at a certain point, as things get worse, it even starts to erode the privileges of the white workers. He says, then we start seeing some overtures of unity. Come, my brother and sister, let's get together. We got to fight. And this is what we see in Madison. This is the early stages. In Occupy, you know, people are starting to talk about class now, right? He says what has traditionally happened in stage 4 is the bourgeoisie moves to resubstantiate the white skin privileges, and then what has happened is the white workers take what he calls the poison bait. It's like a shot of heroin. It's no good. It's not good for you. They submit to the old order again. That's what he blazed that out as a nice framework to think about and consider. And I would argue we're in the beginning stages of stage 3 myself, and we'll come back to that. Go on, Sean. So, getting back to Allen and the history of his book. Where we left it off, he was going to look at those 3 crises. I went off a little on that. So he's ready to start writing that book on the history of the 3 crises to sum up these lessons, which I've just elaborated. And then a book comes out by a guy named Winthrop D. Jordan. It wins the National Book Award in the late 60s. It's called White Over Black, American Attitude Towards the Negroes, 1550 to 1812.